Have you ever noticed how some warnings get laughed at for years, only for people to suddenly start taking them seriously when new information comes out? For a long time, that's exactly what happened with Katt Williams. Whenever he spoke about powerful figures in entertainment, politics, and business, many people dismissed his comments as nothing more than outrageous comedy or attention-grabbing claims. Viewers rolled their eyes, critics brushed him aside, and the mainstream conversation moved on. But then something unexpected happened. As court records, witness testimonies, flight logs, photographs, and previously sealed documents connected to Jeffrey Epstein gradually became public, a growing number of people started revisiting statements Katt had made years earlier. Suddenly, comments that once sounded unbelievable were being replayed across social media. Old interviews began resurfacing, podcast clips collected millions of views, and people who had ignored Katt for years started asking a simple question: why are so many of his warnings being discussed again? What makes this story especially fascinating is that Katt was never focused on just one person. While most headlines centered on Epstein himself, Katt repeatedly suggested that the public was paying attention to the wrong part of the story. According to him, the bigger issue was the network of influential individuals surrounding powerful figures behind closed doors. He argued that wealth, influence, and celebrity often create circles that ordinary people never get to see, and that many of those relationships remain hidden until circumstances force them into the spotlight. As more information emerged over the years, public curiosity exploded. Every newly released document seemed to generate another round of questions. Every resurfaced photograph sparked new debates online. Every witness statement added another layer to a story that many believed was already fully understood. Instead of providing clear answers, the releases often created even more speculation, causing people to dig deeper into old interviews and revisit comments that had previously been ignored. What made Katt stand out was his willingness to speak about uncomfortable subjects long before they became mainstream talking points. Whether people agreed with him or not, he consistently questioned how powerful individuals maintain influence and whether certain relationships receive less scrutiny than they deserve. For years, those observations remained on the fringes of public discussion. Then the Epstein scandal became one of the most talked about stories in modern history, and suddenly audiences were examining those old remarks from a completely different perspective. The conversation quickly grew larger than Epstein himself. It expanded into questions about celebrity culture, elite social circles, political influence, and the ways powerful people interact with one another. Viewers began connecting names, timelines, events, and photographs that had existed publicly for years but had rarely been examined together. The result was a wave of renewed interest unlike anything Katt's earlier interviews had received before, and as people started looking closer at those connections, several famous names would find themselves pulled into one of the most controversial discussions of the last decade. What emerged next would transform a story that many thought they already understood into something far bigger than anyone expected. As public interest in the Epstein story continued to grow, attention eventually turned toward one of the most recognizable names in the world. Long before the controversy became international news, Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein were known to move within many of the same wealthy social circles. During the late 1980s and throughout much of the 1990s, both men were frequently associated with the elite social scene that connected influential business leaders, celebrities, financiers, and political figures. At the time, few people paid much attention to the relationship. To many observers, it appeared to be just another example of two high-profile individuals crossing paths within exclusive circles where power and money often overlapped. Years later, however, old photographs, videos, interviews, and flight records would place that relationship under a microscope, and like anything seen before, as documents became public and media outlets revisited Epstein's history, countless people began examining every available detail. What had once seemed like ordinary social interactions suddenly became the subject of intense public discussion. One of the most frequently cited moments came from a magazine interview conducted years before Epstein's criminal activities became widely known. In that interview, Trump spoke positively about Epstein and described him as someone he had known for a long time. At the time, the remarks attracted little attention, but after Epstein's downfall, those same comments resurfaced across television programs, documentaries, social media platforms, and online forums. Millions of people who had never heard the interview before suddenly found themselves analyzing every word. Then came the photographs and video footage. Images showing the two men attending social events circulated widely online. Clips from parties held decades earlier were viewed millions of times as audiences searched for clues about the nature of their relationship. Each image generated new theories, new debates, and new questions. Some viewers believed the footage revealed nothing unusual, while others argued it deserved closer examination. Regardless of where people stood, the material kept the discussion alive. As more records emerged, public attention shifted toward flight logs and travel records connected to Epstein's private aircraft. The release of those records fueled another wave of headlines and speculation. News organizations, commentators, and internet investigators spent countless hours reviewing documents, attempting to determine who traveled where and when. Every mention of a prominent name seemed to trigger another round of debate. Despite years of public scrutiny, an important distinction remained at the center of the discussion. Multiple reports and investigations noted that being listed in social records, attending events, or appearing in flight logs did not automatically imply involvement in criminal activity. Over time, numerous media organizations emphasized that no direct evidence had publicly emerged linking Trump to Epstein's trafficking operation. Nevertheless, public curiosity refused to fade. What made the situation even more fascinating was the dramatic shift that occurred after Epstein's arrest. Trump publicly distanced himself from Epstein and stated that their relationship had ended many years earlier. He described having a falling out with Epstein long before the scandal became front-page news. Those statements immediately became another major topic of discussion. Supporters pointed to them as evidence that the friendship had ended long ago, while critics questioned the timeline and continued examining older connections. The debate only intensified because the Epstein case had become far larger than a single individual. People were no longer asking only what Epstein had done. They were asking who knew him, who spent time around him, and how deeply his network extended into influential circles. Every public figure connected to that world faced renewed attention, and Trump was no exception. As the conversation expanded, journalists, authors, and investigators began exploring old accounts from people who had known both men during the height of New York's social scene. Some described the relationship as friendly. Others claimed there were tensions and disagreements over time. The result was a complicated picture that seemed to generate more questions than answers, and just when it appeared that public attention had reached its peak, another powerful figure would become the focus of growing scrutiny. And like Trump, this next individual had connections to Epstein that stretched across international charity work, global travel, and some of the most influential organizations in the world. What emerged next would add an entirely new dimension to the story. Just when the public thought it had identified the most controversial names connected to Jeffrey Epstein, attention shifted toward another figure whose association with the financier had been discussed for years. This time, the spotlight landed on former President Bill Clinton, and like many of the relationships that dominated headlines, Clinton's connection to Epstein was often described as being tied to international travel, philanthropy, and global initiatives. But as more documents became public and old records resurfaced, the discussion surrounding that connection grew far larger than anyone expected. For years, Clinton had been one of the most recognizable political figures on the planet. After leaving the White House, he became heavily involved in charitable work, international development projects, and humanitarian efforts across multiple continents. During that period, he frequently met world leaders, business executives, donors, and influential public figures. It was within those circles that Epstein's name repeatedly appeared. As journalists and researchers began reviewing flight logs connected to Epstein's private aircraft, Clinton's name quickly became one of the most discussed entries. Reports indicated that Clinton had traveled on Epstein's plane multiple times during the early years of his post-presidential philanthropic work. Those records immediately fueled headlines across the globe. News outlets analyzed every trip, every passenger list, and every possible connection. Online discussions exploded as people attempted to piece together a clearer picture of the relationship. The situation became even more complicated because many of those trips were connected to charitable initiatives and international programs. Individuals associated with major humanitarian projects were reportedly present on several flights. Supporters argued that these activities demonstrated legitimate professional purposes for the travel. Critics, however, questioned why Epstein appeared so deeply connected to influential philanthropic circles in the first place. As a result, the public debate continued to intensify. What fascinated many observers was Epstein's apparent ability to position himself around some of the world's most powerful people. He seemed to move effortlessly between politics, finance, academia, and philanthropy. The more investigators looked into his network, the more extensive it appeared. This raised a question that continued to dominate public conversations. How had one individual managed to build relationships with so many influential figures across completely different industries? As scrutiny increased, Clinton repeatedly denied having any knowledge of Epstein's criminal activities. Statements released on his behalf emphasized that he had no awareness of the behavior that would later make Epstein infamous worldwide. Clinton's representatives also maintained that he had not visited Epstein's private island, a claim that remained a major focus of public discussion as various allegations and counterclaims circulated through the media. Yet the release of additional records only seemed to generate more questions. Every newly uncovered document reignited interest in events that had occurred decades earlier. Television programs revisited old stories. Podcasts dedicated entire episodes to analyzing timelines. Social media users shared photographs and records that had long existed but were now being viewed through a completely different lens. One reason the discussion persisted was because the Epstein scandal itself had evolved into something larger than a criminal investigation. For many people, it became a symbol of how influence operates behind closed doors. Every connection was examined. Every photograph became significant. Every travel record sparked debate. In that environment, Clinton's association with Epstein remained a subject of ongoing public curiosity regardless of whether new evidence emerged. The controversy intensified further when accusations and claims from various individuals began circulating through documentaries, interviews, and court-related discussions. While many allegations received widespread media coverage, important distinctions remained. Claims often generated headlines even when they were disputed, denied, or unsupported by official findings. This created an atmosphere where speculation frequently traveled faster than verified information, making it difficult for many observers to separate established facts from rumors. Meanwhile, authors, investigators, and journalists continued publishing books, reports, and documentaries examining Epstein's network. Each project introduced new details, new perspectives, and new interpretations. Some portrayed Epstein as a master networker who deliberately surrounded himself with influential individuals. Others focused on the unanswered questions that continued to linger years after his arrest. Regardless of the angle, Clinton's name remained part of the broader conversation. As public fascination with the case continued, another familiar face unexpectedly entered the spotlight. And like politicians whose connections were tied to fundraising events and international travel, this individual came from the entertainment world. His appearance in flight records and photographs would trigger an entirely new wave of online speculation and media attention. And what happened next would show just how far-reaching Epstein's network appeared to be. Just as public attention continued focusing on politicians and world leaders connected to Jeffrey Epstein, another unexpected name found itself pulled into the growing conversation. This time, it was Academy Award-winning actor Kevin Spacey. Unlike some of the other figures whose relationships with Epstein stretched across years of social events and public appearances, Spacey's connection became a major topic largely because of one specific trip that continued generating questions long after it took place. For many people, Spacey was known as one of Hollywood's most accomplished actors. His career included critically acclaimed performances, major awards, and decades of success in the entertainment industry. But when records connected to Epstein began receiving worldwide attention, old travel documents suddenly placed Spacey into a story that few expected him to be part of. The focus centered on a humanitarian trip to Africa that took place in the early 2000s. The journey reportedly involved several high-profile individuals, including former President Bill Clinton and other public figures associated with charitable and international development projects. At the time, the trip attracted little controversy. It was viewed largely as a philanthropic mission connected to global aid efforts. Few people paid close attention to the details. Years later, everything changed. As Epstein's history became one of the most heavily investigated stories in modern media, researchers began examining every available flight record connected to his private aircraft. During that process, records showing Spacey's presence on flights associated with the humanitarian trip resurfaced. Almost immediately, headlines began appearing across news outlets and social media platforms. What had once been an obscure travel detail suddenly became the center of intense public discussion. The situation escalated because many people were now asking a broader question that extended far beyond Spacey himself. If Epstein's criminal behavior eventually became public knowledge, how many influential individuals had crossed paths with him before those activities were widely known? It was a question that fueled endless debates online. As videos, articles, and podcasts revisited the trip, speculation began spreading rapidly. Some observers questioned how much participants knew about Epstein at the time. Others argued that simply being present on a flight did not indicate any awareness of future allegations. The debate became increasingly polarized as different groups interpreted the same information in completely different ways. Spacey eventually addressed the issue publicly. He stated that he had not known the extent of Epstein's activities and explained that his involvement in the trip was connected to the humanitarian mission itself. rather than any personal relationship with Epstein. According to his account, he was participating alongside individuals connected to charitable organizations and public service initiatives. Yet, even as explanations emerged, public curiosity continued growing. Part of the reason was that the Epstein story had become much larger than any single piece of evidence. Every photograph, every flight record, and every reported interaction seemed to generate weeks of discussion. People were no longer looking at isolated events. They were attempting to understand the larger network surrounding Epstein and how it operated for so many years without attracting greater scrutiny. Another moment that intensified attention involved photographs showing Spacey alongside Ghislaine Maxwell at public events. As those images circulated online, countless viewers began analyzing them. Critics argued that the photos demonstrated overlapping social circles, while others pointed out that attendance at public functions did not automatically reveal the nature of personal relationships. Once again, the same evidence produced completely different interpretations depending on who was examining it. What made the situation particularly remarkable was how quickly public perception could shift. An event that had received almost no attention when it originally occurred was now being dissected in extraordinary detail years later. Every timeline was revisited. Every reported interaction was reviewed. Every appearance became part of a larger narrative that people were trying to understand. The more the public learned about Epstein's connections, the more it seemed that his influence had reached into nearly every corner of elite society. Politics, business, entertainment, academia, and philanthropy all appeared to intersect within the same network. This realization fueled even greater interest because it suggested that the story extended far beyond a single individual. As the discussion surrounding Spacey continued, another name was already beginning to overshadow every other figure connected to the scandal. And like the celebrities and politicians whose associations generated debate, this next individual faced allegations that would trigger international headlines, royal controversy, and one of the most damaging public relations disasters in modern history. And when that story exploded into public view, it would become impossible for the world to look away.